Mikheil Saakashvili, who was president of Georgia, elected president after the peaceful Rose Revolution. He became the youngest president in the world. And as I mentioned, he proceeded to introduce a series of far-reaching reforms, a lot of them that began to impress observers from all around the world. Under his leadership, for example, Georgia became the World Bank's #1 reformer in its ease of doing business rankings. It moved from 127th to number 8. It moved 70 positions in reducing corruption in the Transparency International rankings. On our own Economic Freedom of the World report that we produce with the Fraser Institute, it is now ranked as the 16th most free economy in the world, and that is remarkable. Some of these reforms really were remarkable. I mentioned, or somebody has mentioned, the police reform and the drop in corruption. I think that Dalibor was speaking about that. The police reform made Georgia one of the safest countries in Europe. It went from being one of the most dangerous countries to one of the safest. It did some radical reforms in other areas as well, some of them not as well known. In the current issue of Regulation magazine, we have an article by Steve Hanke that outlines how Georgia outsourced its regulation of pharmaceuticals, and that immediately had an effect of dropping the price of medicines and creating competition and eliminating a whole lot of bureaucracy there. It was that kind of reform in a whole lot of areas that has made Georgia such a remarkable story. It's not just a story of reform and high growth, it's a story of innovative reforms. And these happened under some very adverse conditions. We all know about the global financial crisis. We also know about the war with Russia and its occupation of parts of Georgia. These conditions only seem to strengthen the resolve of the Georgian government even more in pressing forward on economic reform. So we're very pleased, as I said, to welcome President Saakashvili to the podium.
Thank you, Marian. Thank you. I'm very honored to address this remarkable audience and to finally make it to Cato Institute. As many of you, as basically lots of people who come to DC, I've always driven by, and this is the first time I was actually admitted inside this remarkable institution. I have to say that I fully agree with economic notions of Cato Institute and totally disagree with foreign policy stance of this remarkable institution. But these are the complexities of our approach. But otherwise, I have to say that, of course, your stand up for world liberty is the main thing that basically unites this audience and us worldwide and makes the idea of this think tank so attractive. I also want to greet, beside this hall, the people who are gathered at Saakashvili Presidential Library. This happened to be the only public building that was built in Georgia for the last 2 years since I left my office. Needless to say that before that country was rebuilt with amazing pace. I have to greet these people because I don't have opportunity to go there due to a number of very politicized cases started by the new government of Georgia against me. But I have to say that today, thank you for all this introduction. You already spoke about benchmarks, and for small countries, benchmarks do matter. That's our kind of, when you introduce our country, you have to talk about these places in rankings. But I think the most remarkable transformation that really happened in Georgia and that makes Georgia so attractive for all this region is the change of approaches, the change of mentality. we all were in this vicious circle of post-Soviet, we're captive of this post-Soviet, Soviet hopelessness. And the way of thinking, the way of doing things, the way of not doing things, the way of basically following stereotypes. And this is not only post-Soviet. I remember, I studied at Kiev State University, and obviously there were lots of, I studied with some remarkable people like my classmate Petro Poroshenko of Ukraine now, but also we had lots of students from third world countries. Majority of them were from third world countries. And during one of my first official visits to France, to Paris actually, I was contacted by my former classmate from one of the African countries, with whom I was friends at the university, and who learned about my visit there from French TV. So he would absolutely wanted to come and see me. So I told him, yeah, well, let's have drinks. And so he came we went to the bar downstairs at my hotel. And so he had been prime minister of one of the African countries for several years prior to that. So he made it to the top before me. And he told me, look, I came here to give you an advice, and I think I already have experience, so I need to share it with you. And my advice is that, until, I don't know how long will you stay in office, but as long as you stay in office, steal as much as you can. Steal. And because he said, I regret every single cent that I didn't steal when I was there. There were so many opportunities. And you know what? I would say majority of officials in our part of the world have this mentality. And there are reasons why they have this mentality. Because you look at members of my government there, Andrei presented some of them, and I think I've asked myself whether many of them are asking themselves the same question: were we idiots? Were we stupid? Why didn't we steal? Why didn't we use our opportunities? Georgia's budget grew how many times? 7 times or 8? No, 11 times during my presidency. 11 times, with tax decrease of 60%. Georgia's nominal GDP almost tripled. Maybe we could benefit, get out of this many, many billions, maybe 1 billion just, for 20, 50, 60 persons to share just for living expenses. Why not? Because the reality is that these people now, they are spread all around the world. Some of them were arrested in Georgia, not so many of them, and there are cases against them for abuse of office. They couldn't really say that they stole money, but they said they misspent money. There is a case against me for instance, my office apparently bought several suits for official occasions. I wasn't even aware of that, and there is a criminal case against me on that one. They started with the fact that they were saying I stole 19 billion, and then it all trickled down to several suits and a few other things. But the reality is that we had this government that has this sense of that they were building a new country. And they were young, they were idealistic, and I was always telling them, none of us will have our own hotel, our own university, our own restaurant, our own small company. But meanwhile, when I became president, we had 100,000 tourists, and when I left the office, there were still almost 6 million. So, which meant that a huge number of hotels were built, huge number of infrastructure. None of them belongs to any members of my government. But I was telling them, when they built 500 hotels in Georgia, we can say we all have 500 hotels as a country. You all have the 500 hotels. You all have these new roads. You all have these new companies. You all are part of this big success. And here they are when they left the office and they were chased out of the country or they were arrested there. Some people had bank credits, they couldn't pay it, so they lost their apartments. Some people had at least this long-term thing for stability. Some people had credits for cars, some people had other commitments that they've taken, and it's basically they neither acquired long-term stability nor they acquired wealth. So, and that's Georgia's example is very indicative of that yeah, it's not a clear road to, there are no clear ups in history, there are ups and downs. And really, what really changed in Georgia was this, but still I think these people, despite these past personal setbacks, can claim one big thing, that they left a real country behind with real functioning institutions. Of course, still Georgia was a poor country. It went to lower middle income country category. It's still a long way to go in terms of PPP and GDP, but we did achieve considerable progress. I mean, extreme poverty was reduced more than twice. Lots of critical things like, for instance, we had a very high infant mortality. It was reduced by 3.5 times, and many other things that we achieved there in terms of quality of living. But also country change in terms of appearance, in terms of many things. I mean, if Georgia is to be accepted to the European Union tomorrow, we might not need the same kind of money from the European Union as most of Eastern Europe got, say for roads, for infrastructure, for bridges, for other things. We've already done all that on our own, most of it, well, of course, with some international institutional assistance. But there is this thing that the change of mentality and what was clashback behind, because the way how it worked, we can talk as much what comes first. Institutions are more important than personalities. Personalities create institutions, etc. In long run, institutions matter and they might be decisive. But I would say that absolutely primordial is personality and leadership. There are no ready recipes, but the one thing is clear: if people at the top believe what they are doing, then the change happens. Not their plans, not scientific scholars, because I often hear, we should bring big group of advisors and advisors will advise and they will, does work. We started our reforms by ignoring almost every single piece of advice from IMF and the World Bank. And I remember that when we lowered taxes by 60%, IMF, when basically the Georgian treasury was empty, IMF came to us and they told us, "You are crazy guys, you are committing suicide, and there is no way we would ever sign this program." And we told them, "Give us 6 months," and then I don't know in how many months' time, they said we were so proud and happy that we supported this great reform program of the Georgian government. So I don't really believe that there is this thing, every time they were behind us. So whenever the governments are appreciated by the fact that, they are listening to every advice, I think that those countries that have such governments are in trouble. Because that's not a real leadership. They just, okay, I also admit that there are many cases when these advice are better than what the governments are doing. But that doesn't speak very well about those governments, right? And so it's more about what the international organization will be doing. It will be more damage limitation than the real stuff. Now, but the thing is that when I talk about leadership, it's about personal advice, because personal leadership and personal example. Because I remember when we changed all these things, when we have got this increase of all these benchmarks, then corruption disappeared from life. We had these public service halls. We had the world's fastest customs procedure, according to IFC, world's fastest document ID issuance, world's fastest registration of companies, world's fastest construction permits, world's fastest property transactions. And then people started to say, okay, they tackled petty corruption, because that's also approach of many Western experts, quote unquote, because they were saying, yeah, but then they gladly accepted this thesis that there is no petty corruption, but there is elite corruption. That is to say, Saakashvili, his ministers are making money. Of course, that's really people. Nobody is asking money from people, like lower level officials are not making money, but these guys, of course, are making money. It's such a bullshit. But this reflects fundamentally this kind of, looking down on all these countries and saying, only OECD countries are capable of real reforms. Only West can do real reforms. And these guys, not really. Something should be wrong there. Something is not clean. That's fundamental approach, which I also confronted from the West. Lots of times, most of the time of my presidency and post-presidency when I see the assessments after. because they fundamentally, very many people here also in this town cannot believe that there can be genuine cases of success. But then again, going back to this issue, there is no way, under any circumstance, if the leaders are corrupt, then the others will not be corrupt. No way, because everything comes from personal example. And I'll give you very clear cases. Like, for instance, when you have, I had a predecessor who was the richest man in the country until some Russian oligarchs from Russia showed up, because they plundered much more money than my predecessor could in Georgia. But he was rich because he owned the main cell phone company, his family, and he basically at a certain moment it was a monopolist, that company, but then I was head of Parliament's anti-corruption committee, and we forced them to admit other companies into market, but they had enough advantage before. And then this Shevardnadze's wealth grew 4 times or 5 times in my presidency, because that's how capitalization of his company grew. And he had cousins, he has nephews that were, monopolizing all sector and all kinds of smuggling. Usually, what happens in those countries, that's smuggling that matters. So you have people in the police and relatives everywhere in these sectors that they did. Main principle of my government was no relatives and no nepotism anywhere in any positions. This was absolute must. And these things should be enforced proactively. Not only we didn't appoint our relatives or whatever people, and the important thing about Georgian government that this was a very unhomogeneous group. We had nothing in similar. It's a small country, but there were lots of people from different regions, from different backgrounds. None of us were really in the same class anywhere or in the same neighborhood mostly, or into same social kind of origin. Very diverse group. The only principle was that people are idealistic and committed to doing something. And that was the thing, that not a single tribal group or ethnic or religious or, whatever, or the Lake Cooperative of Russia or St. Petersburg gang, sorry for everybody from St. Petersburg, yes, but obviously, but people from entirely different backgrounds. And this was absolute mass that you don't allow this thing. And not only that, of course, the temptation for relatives to become successful businessmen was great, because before only relatives could make money. Because if you would not enforce proactively this would happen anyway, which meant that I had to instruct our Ministry of Interior and security officials there to closely follow my relatives so that they don't somehow to report immediately if they start any movements in the business, and God forbid, they become successful in business. That's what you do in those countries. I mean, there are many Western countries where they don't do it. I know most of them, but in our countries, you have to do it, because that's an absolute must if you want to give this set personal example. Because, the way how it works and how we talk about police reform, Georgia became the safest country in Europe, safer than Iceland, for 5 consecutive years, until way back to the end of my presidency. Why police was corrupt? It wasn't just that every policeman was taking bribe in the street, which, by the way, happens still in some European Union members as well, still. But the issue was that who knew whom in this society. And it's very simple, The biggest confrontation we had in Georgia, there were first of all several things. There were informal institute of thieves in law, and Georgians were very good at that. 80% of thieves in law in former Soviet space and now in Austria, places like Barcelona, we have proud privilege, dubious privilege of having them originate from Georgia. So we had these organized criminal groups that were based on family, tribal, and other ties. But also the mentality of the thing, the biggest confrontation we really started, I remember the start of our confrontation inside Georgian society was when some 3 or 4 guys from wealthy families were arrested for quite heavy criminal offense. And then Georgia's most famous then theater director called Minister of Interior and told him, these are my guys. why don't we let them go and I'll find a way to punish them myself. And was extremely surprised that Minister of Interior said no. And that was the moment when from praising us wildly, he turned immediately to hating us 10 times more wildly. Because he felt immediate danger. Because in all previous times, in Soviet times, post-Soviet times, he would call First Secretary of Central Committee, Minister of Interior, my predecessor president, and they would do just anything for him because they are this caste of society that were entitled to such things. So, and that's what, there you have this class structure and you have meritocracy, you have, and when I talk, for me, criterion of democracy is not just having formally free media or having formally free elections. The main criteria for me personally is upward social mobility. Georgia had positive migration balance for all the years of my presidency, except 1 year, the year of post-crisis and war with Russia, 2009, because young people stopped to leave the country despite still very low GDP PPP rates. And the reason why it happened, that young people suddenly saw opportunities for themselves. Of course, this also involved social tension because then the other people felt sidelined, but they were not in position to live anymore, and that was a painful issue. But young people held this. So for me, this is the thing, that you bring up these young people, and they have another kind of mentality. I remember I met in a street cafe a young person and that told me, look, she was executive of a major, like president, CEO of the biggest, I forget that moment, insurance company, told me. She became number 2 there when she was 22. She told me, my friends became MPs, so one of them later became minister. And she said, we were crazy, 22, 23 years old. And we brought our social habits. We, fell in love, we were drinking, we were dancing in nightclubs, we were doing crazy things, we were fighting with each other. We were just doing all the things that young people do. So the stereotype of being in position of power or responsibility and at the same time don't think this match in our society, right? But she told me, but only we could do the things that were done. And this is exactly what also involved mental change. And my advice to my Ukrainian friends and my classmates and others who I'm friends with, all of them, was that bring lots of 25-year-olds to many positions of power. Doesn't mean that you should neglect or ignore the others, but bring lots of them up, because by themselves they will not come. You just need to create opportunities artificially to bring them up. And that's also very important when we talk about what happened. And nepotism is absolute thing, because the issue is that when you create one exception, when you create one exempt business or one exempt family or one case when somebody is treated in more privileged way, the whole system collapses. And I have to tell you that we have unfortunate example of this now in Georgia. With all the successes, with new cities we built, with all the institutional change we did, and Georgia was an amazing case. You told me, Marian just said that it was the most successful case of transformation worldwide. I don't know, maybe it could be a little bit of an overstretch, but it was extremely successful based on from where we were coming. We were the most criminalized, the most corrupt, the most hopeless, the most cynical part of a very cynical, corrupted, criminal part of the world. And saying that it was a remarkable transformation from hopelessness and from absence of any prospect to really performing, fast developing new country that looked different. That, I look at images of my inauguration back 9 years ago. I'm just writing a book now, and I will go through video archives. At first reaction, me and my assistant, that we were looking at these images, were that we said, do we only have black and white images? But then we realized they were colorful, but it was so different. We took over a different country. Yes, and we took over a country that had these kind of dark colors, no electricity most of the time, and it looks bad. And so when it's a remarkable case of transformation, but we also see remarkable, another bad case of how country with performing institution success case can be turned back and can be destroyed. And I think the main hope I have, because we have bad geopolitics now, we have internal issues, main hope is that people are used to better services. There was a cultural backlash against our reforms because we took the country from here and brought it here. And of course, there was many things that the speed of human nature doesn't accept the speed of this change. But once you are already here, you also don't accept those leaders who want you to bring it back here, right? So society will have to eventually digest and move forward and go forward rather than try to go back. So from that standpoint, I see, I'm completely finishing now, but I see warring sides. I see signs, but for instance, the other day, a Russian oligarch, post-Soviet oligarch that was coming to Georgia, and you remember first my years of my presidency, and was asking to monopolize one of the fields of economy, and of course was making eyes at us that, we'll deal with each other, you guys. Of course, we sent him away. He did this now in Georgia. He was just having, I heard, very productive meetings with our several ministers, and they basically introduced the system, which makes problems with people. It's in the healthcare sector. Suddenly, a very abrupt change of selling medicines, pharmaceuticals. You mentioned pharmaceuticals, that's why I remembered it. Yes, we deregulated, and suddenly the government over-regulated it, but over-regulated, and suddenly oligarchs showed up. And is benefiting apparently from it. So it's a revenge 9 years later. Or suddenly relatives are again in charge. We have a country that's run from offshore, political offshore, because we have former prime minister who always ran his businesses from offshores, and now he's running country from offshore of his house. And suddenly his relatives are becoming very prominent businessmen again. One exception, one thing, that's the difference between us and Ukraine. Because I was asked by somebody from my library, and I finished about that question, what's the difference in transition? I think the main thing is Ukrainians haven't seen improvement after Orange Revolution, unfortunately so, because it got stuck from the very beginning. The people in Georgia did see it, which means that they will no longer tolerate deterioration of services. They will no longer taking away opportunities of equal access. They will no longer tolerate that lights are off or water disappears or whatever. They just are used to another standard of government service, and they don't want to go back, even if they might not like the politicians who created this new reality for that, or like that changes from time to time, obviously. So from that standpoint, I'm optimistic in long and medium run. It's very painful to watch what's happening now, but I think still Georgia's example creates more pros than cons of great innovative transformation idealism. I ultimately think that idealism, not advices, not schemes, not scholarly, with all due respect to all the scholars, studies and reports, but idealism is the main motive that moves any country or any society forward. Thank you.